Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 2, Chapter 8, Section 7, Zhuni Ore and Clay. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny
Hey,
and Zongjun Li.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. How has the definition of Zhuni changed over time? And why is there still debate as to the definition of Zhuni ore?
Zisha was the very original name that people coined this specific type of clay back in the days. And at the time, people doesn't know too much about the formation or the chemical composition of this specific type of clay, unlike today. So for the longest time, people tend to call clays with similar color Zhuni at large. And it was really until the modern days, people start to really understand the formation of Zhuni and how its connection to Nenli, and also the chemical composition compared to other types of clay with sometimes similar type of color scheme, like some hongni or even some Zhuni as well.
just building off that, I think there's a few different naming schemes which we've seen through time. People naming something Junie based on the color of the unfired ore, naming it Junie based on the color of the fired clay. And then we see different uses based on whether or not someone is a teapot user versus a teapot maker. So people through the F1 period are calling things that contain some blend maybe of Junie and hongni, most likely hongni pots. But, if you wanted to sell it for more, particularly as we got into the 90s and early 2000s when Junie is highly in demand by Taiwanese tea connoisseurs, you probably would call something that's hongni a Junie, right? And I think often in Taiwan, as you mentioned in the chapter, things were basically called Junie when they were just superior quality clays, regardless of whether or not they were actually weathered nunni. So I think in this book, you set out to define Junie as weathered nunni versus hongni, which it's been at different points in time confused to be a subtype of, which is in fact weathered bini.
Does Zhuni ore need to slacken water to be Zhuni?
That's almost a common understanding in the community for a long time. But in our visit to Yixing, we heard some other opinions about certain types of Zhuni not slacking in water, which sometimes being considered as higher quality by ceramists in Yixing. So I think the answer is maybe debatable, maybe not all Zhuni slack in water, but that's also up to our audience judgment.
We heard this from a few specific craftsmen, but I wonder if we were able to go out and talk to even more, not that we had the time, but interested in what we might hear next time we make our way out there, if we could find some craftsmen or who are of a different mindset or camp as far as Junie is concerned.
How does the variations in weathering affect the material for use of Zhuni ore?
Some of the more direct changes are changes in the color to the ore, which can affect the fired color, but obviously firing temperature has a bigger impact on that. But the different styles of weathering for Junie can also really impact the texture of the fired teapot skin. You have a quote or a poem in this book about the texture of Junie, and texture has often been a defining characteristic in the past for Junie. So different weatherings can definitely lead to different skin patterns.
And also clay processing sometimes have a huge impact on the final texture and performance of Zhuni too. You sometimes sit out larger chunks or particles from the clay, resulting in a very uniformic texture. And sometimes ceramists decided to add some Zhuni grog or some different grit size of Zhuni into the blend so that you have a more dynamic surface texture.
I think you importantly note in this chapter as well that there's a difference between the ore withering and the clay weathering. The ore and the clay weathering are two very different things, as mentioned in previous chapters as well, but particularly because at least the classical thought or the broad thought on Junie ore was that when it's put in water, it will slack. The type of weathering obviously was very different, but when we think about weathering for the ore versus the clay, they're two separate things. And one is obviously occurring in nature and can be happening unexposed at deeper layers of the rock bed and in strata, or it could be happening exposed, which probably would have happened more likely in older times when there was exposed mine site, nunni sites.
And also sometimes semi-exposed, which resulting in a blend of some Neni versus some Zhuni. So it's pretty interesting if you think about that, because it's almost like a natural blend of different types of clay, which results a very interesting gradient of different color for Zhuni.
Zhuni is often seen as more mythical and, I believe, prone to the hyperreal than other Zisha clays. Why might this be the case?
I think a portion of it is the rarity of the ore itself. So I think you have a figure somewhere in here around 4% of all the Zisha clay mined in Yixing is Zhuni ore. So it's a very low amount. I think hongni was maybe double that. Or rarity, I think definitely plays into part of the mythical status.
Yeah, definitely. And also the name being vermilion, people will have a natural connection with Taoism. And I think that adds some subconsciously valuable notion to people's mind.
I think also some of the naming structures for Zhuni that we've seen in the past, merchant groups in Taiwan just calling basically their best hongni pots Zhuni, or saving Zhuni as basically a superlative, has also caused some of that perception.
Yeah, Zhu naturally, the character is a higher status among all the Hong, like all the red. So I think there's some kind of consumer cognition that's playing in this game.
It's an S tier red. It's S tier
Yeah.
red.
Does the Hong Pao Zhuni exist?
Depends on who's selling the teapot.
It's a good answer. Would you buy a Da Hong Pao Zhuni teapot?
No, I would not, nor would I buy Da Hong Pao of any other clay.
You wouldn't buy a Da Hong Pao hongni?
I'm willing to test and taste tea out of any pot, but I have a feeling that just adding Da Hong Pao to anything adds a zero where it may not be warranted.
Yeah, honestly, anything with the name Da Hong Pao, I would put a question mark on it. Even Da Hong Pao tea.
But it's the merchant's best, Zongjun. Is Zhuni more special than any other Zisha clay in any way? Is it just rarity and the confusion around names that have made it so prone to eulogizing and mythologizing? Or is there something that inspired all of that focus on this one specific Zisha clay?
A good Zhuni teapot is a goddamn good pot. We all own some of the same Zhuni teapots, but many of us have had chances to use antiques. I think Zongjun and I might not have too many of those in our collection, but we've had a chance to use many. And they do have material effects on tea that are highly desired. So there is a reason, I think, for all of the hoopla around Zhuni. I just think that because there was amazing effects attributed to it, it just slowly snowballed into something more than what it really is. But it's certainly worthy of going out and adding a few Zhuni to your collection.
I think the difficulty of building one Zhuni teapot also played into a pretty significant role, because the stickiness and the high shrinkage rate, which resulting in a very high crackage rate during firing for Zhuni, really made it difficult to construct, basically. It's not just the rarity of the clay, but also the rarity of the pot itself. And also because of the difficulty of building such teapot, I think a lot of the higher level ceramists consider Zhuni as like a challenge for them to construct teapot for. So some of the higher artistic value teapot are oftentimes made by Zhuni.
That was something that I wanted to hit on. You believe that because the artistry was more difficult with Zhuni, that it was taken on, and because the Zhuni ore was rare, which made it more expensive, it created this nice positive feedback cycle where the nicest pots were made by the best artists in Zhuni clay.
Yeah, I think there's a compounding effect of multiple factors.
Reverse causation.
Do either of you use and collect Zhuni?
Collect is a strong word for me. Definitely use. As you both know, buying a house. So I'm not currently seeking out antique Zhuni, but I do have a couple Zhuni pots. And we were just discussing a little bit earlier before recording just how good those pots are. We have pots that Jason, you commissioned from a craftsman, and I use those pots for everything, and they have such great effect. But I have a few other Zhuni in my collection, and all I'm quite happy with. Low porosity, quite a high firing, and they still do have an effect on tea. It's not like they're porcelain, but the muting is much lower on all of my Zhuni teapots than some of my Zhuni, for example. And so I can really get a lot of depth and clarity from almost any tea that I want to put into those pots.
Yeah, clarity, and also sometimes a lot of magnifying effect of certain attributes that I really like. some roasted notes from some higher roast oolong is what I really like to put into a Zhuni teapot.
You own, of course, the same commissioned piece. Do you own other Zhuni wares, or is that the only Zhuni teapot you own?
I think I need to start building up my Zhuni collection as you guys do, but it's a little expensive to commit.
I think all of my Zhuni is from that same potter that I bought from when I was there in April. So I only have maybe 2 other pieces beyond the ones that we have commissioned. So I'm in the same camp as you, Zongjun. I think once I start buying more pots again, Zhuni will probably be on the list.
Right. I'm glad it's not a long way to catch up.
Well, if we're playing catch up, we both got a long way to catch up with Jason on Zhuni.
Wistfully staring here at the collection. Speaking of my collection, I have antique Zhuni in my collection. What proportion of the clay is actually Zhuni?
You mean that you, in the 1 week that's passed since our hongni chapter, you haven't developed the skill to touch the teapot and immediately from your fingertips feel all the information stored within the clay and know the exact blend proportion? You haven't learned how to do that?
Antique, Ching.
For the listeners at home, Jason's touching the teapot. His fingers are telling him everything he needs to know.
And I'm getting less than 100%. I'm getting less than 100% Zhuni.
Oh, geez.
Wow.
What a surprise. That teapot looked beautiful, by the way. As you wrote in the book, we all, I don't want to say fetishize, but we all really love Zhuni, antique Zhuni. But we know that even though we call these pots antique Zhuni, it's almost 100% likely that they are not fully Zhuni teapots and that they are a blend of either Zhuni with hongni, Zhuni with nunni, or some other Zisha clay, Zhuni blended with more pre-fired Zhuni. So there's a lot of different variations on what it could be, but it's very unlikely that any pot you have that is Zhuni is pure Zhuni unless it's modern.
Yeah, even with the modern technique, the crackage rate for firing Zhuni can be as high as 40% in a batch. So in the past, people tend to add Zhuni grog or other materials to strengthen the structural integrity of Zhuni when it gets fired.
Is there an argument against using, say, cooked Zhuni grogs? If you have broken Zhuni teapots, you crush and remill the pre-fired Zhuni material and then you add that back into raw Zhuni. Is there an argument against that? Is that detrimental for the teapot, even if it helps survivability?
We've heard one such argument from a craftsman that we spent some time with in Yixing. I know you got the exact quote. I can't quite find it right here in front of me, but he basically said that it dulls the original flavor of the ore. So by adding back pre-fired ore, there's something that is special about that original fired ore that is being lost when you add back pre-fired grog. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know.
Yeah, he used the word cooked, which is really a flavor note that you want to avoid when you brew tea in a teapot. It's a cooked flavor.
It was an interesting argument. I've never heard anyone speak against using pre-cooked grog previously, pre-fired grog. It's a fairly common technique in Western ceramics, fairly common technique in other ceramic artistry. And to hear, okay, all of these teapots are cracking in the kiln, you just grind them up and reuse some of the material. He's like, absolutely not. No, that is bad. And only bad teapots are made from pre-cooked clay. I'd not heard that argument before.
I just sell it to all the other teapot makers who will make bad teapots.
At the same time, the artist also claimed that certain Zhuni doesn't slack in water. So maybe he was just using that specific type of Zhuni, which doesn't require adding grog to have Zhuni have a stronger structural integrity during building.
Are all Zhuni blends acceptable as Zhuni teapots? You mentioned Zhuni and hongni, but say, is Zhuni and duanni, is that okay?
I don't think there's anything that's not okay. It just depends, I think, on what you're being sold. If you're just being told it's a Zhuni teapot and it's, in fact, 25% Zhuni, 75% duanni, might be nice to know what you're buying, right?
The opposite. 75,
25. I think, honestly, I'd probably be pretty happy. A 75% Zhuni teapot, that sounds pretty good to me. If it's sold as just a Zhuni teapot, I think I'd probably be happy.
So a Zhuni duanni blend, majority Zhuni is okay. Zongjun, do you think that's strange, or would you buy that if you knew what it was?
It's a little strange of the combination. And also, like...
They had the price point to match, though.
You really have to put into the mind that different types of clay doesn't necessarily have a very similar center temperature range. So sometimes certain additional clay might not be fired properly when you blend the clays together. I'm not sure.
I'm trusting in my craftsman that he's blended a good blend that has both made his life easier for moldability, fireability, and will make my life as a teapot user better. But sounds like I'm trusting.
This is 17% duanni. Like, why is this teapot leaking?
Under fire, duanni. This is why you have to go to Yixing and meet your Yixing merchant in person and test teapots before you buy.
We're keeping the barrier to entry on using Yixings real low. Just go to Yixing and meet your teapot maker, and then you'll be fine.
Read the 1,000-page book, go to Yixing, meet the teapot maker.
Don't even start with Yixing until you've got at least 20K in the bank to break on Yixings.
Study Chinese for 10 years.
Super accessible hobbies.
Many collectors only consider Zhuni from Zhaozhuang Shashan as original. Do you consider Zhuni from Baoshan as Ben Shan as well, or do you agree with these other collectors?
The material properties as we know them can slightly differ between the mine sites. However, I think you have to take each Zhuni teapot for what it is. You shouldn't just be using a pot based on the ore and the clay type, right? You need to test them anyway. So I think as long as you're getting the kind of results that you would expect and the performance you would expect from Zhuni, whether it's from Baoshan or Zhaozhuang, if it's giving you Zhuni-like results, it's Zhuni. I think for me, whether or not it comes from the original mine site is not a strong argument to me of whether or not it is truly Zhuni.
Just like a lot of the tea, right? Sometimes people will consider certain region Ben Shan, but sometimes there are multiple Ben Shans in a certain region. It's all really based on people's belief in the clay and the performance of certain clay and their relationship with geographic location. I think that's really subjective in most cases. As long as the clay suffices your preference in brewing tea, I think it's good clay.
For the record, I consider Baoshan as Ben Shan for Zhuni. As long as it's Zhuni ore and Zhuni material, it's Zhuni. Do you find Zhuni harder or easier to use than other Zisha clays?
I think I actually find it easier. I think it's easier to hit at least an acceptable result. I think it can be harder to find the perfect result, but I think it is easier to find acceptable results with a Zhuni teapot. You won't often have Zhuni paired with something and go, oh, this is so dull or doesn't taste like anything, or oh, this muted the hell out of the tea. You might get some weird notes now and then, but generally it will perform as well as porcelain and sometimes way better.
Yeah, I agree. And also Zhuni tend to really magnify the flavor of a lot of tea, which might be difficult to find good teas to pair with your Zhuni teapot. If you put into a flaw tea in the Zhuni teapot, it will taste even worse.
Yeah, don't brew your odds and ends in Zhuni.
Are there any special considerations to take when using Zhuni?
My personal go-tos, I think green oolong, as Zongjun mentioned, roasted oolong, aged pu'er. Those are kind of things that I reach for Zhuni for, but I think I would, once again, as we've said all throughout this book, test your pot with everything.
And also when buying new pots, do examine the pot very carefully because there might be sometimes minor flaws in the teapot that you want to avoid. Zhuni is very delicate and sometimes small crackage can be hard to notice.
That's a great one. Heat your pot. Zhuni loses heat faster than you'd expect.
Yeah.
Everyone, that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you for joining us in this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for our next conversation, Luni ore and clay.